January 6, 1940. The U.S. is at peace but on the brink of entering World War II and finds herself in fear of an imminent invasion from Nazi Germany. The likely invasion route into the U.S., the Appalachians, was feared to be easily pushed aside and conquered unopposed due to the conflict of the U.S. not having a specialized mountain force. In compromise to this, the U.S. forms a mountain division of her own to oppose the feared elite German mountain troops. However, this fighting force, named the 10th Mountain Division, would instead go on to fight the Germans in the mountainous terrain of northern Italy, where they would relieve bogged-down Allied forces and spearhead an Allied offensive against the Germans while aiding in the quick liberation of northern Italy. In mid-January of 1940, Nazi Germany advanced unopposed across Europe, and with Britain on the edge of collapse, many Americans feared that the European war would soon find its way to the homeland. In defense to this, Lewis Johnson, the Assistant Secretary of War, asked Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall on what consideration had been given for the formation of a military Alpine division, one that the U.S. found themselves without, leaving them vulnerable to fight in mountain warfare, which would be essential in defending territory across the northern Appalachians in case of attack. Mountain warfare had already proved to be a vital and very effective fighting force in the beginning of World War II, when Finland defended off the invading Soviet Union. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Finns showed that trained mountain troops were far superior against standard infantry and armored regiments in rugged terrain. In December of 1939, 2 years before the U.S. would enter World War II, the War Department saw little need in the funding or formation of a mountain warfare program. It would take nearly 2 years before one would be established. It may have taken longer without the aid of the National Ski Patrol Committee, headed by Charles Dole, who helped provide the necessary equipment and training for the long-to-become 10th Mountain Division. The National Ski Patrol Committee would also be in charge of recruiting experienced skiers for the division, requiring 3 letters of recommendation, proving the recruit's ability to ski. Meanwhile, the Army was already in the process of developing a training facility at Fort Lewis, Washington, near Mount Rainier. Within months, the Army had enough men to finally establish the 87th Regiment, the first of 3 regiments in the 10th Mountain Division. Only 2 weeks later, the U.S. was brought into the war, with the attack on Pearl Harbor sparking a massive influx of new recruits filling the ranks of the 87th. The Army soon realized that the facilities at Fort Lewis would not be suitable for a year-round training ground, and was then forced to transfer all mountain exercises to Colorado's Camp Hale that was built to house some 15,000 men. The 87th was joined with the formation of the 86th in November of 1942 and the 85th Regiment in July of the next year. Over the course of the next year, the 10th would continue to strengthen and develop its combat readiness at Camp Hale. Learning to ski with some 90 pounds of equipment, along with performing exercises at negative 35 degrees at 10,000 feet elevation, were just some of the hardships the men faced. The ski troops also trained in rock climbing and developed the use of pack mules in the mountains for transporting field artillery in deep snow. A mountain engineer division of the 10th also developed a cable aerial tramway, enabling the troops to transport casualties and much-needed supplies across expansive, rugged terrain that would have taken 6 or more hours on foot. These skills would prove vital in the deployment of the division, which would finally come in January of 1945. After nearly 4 years, the U.S. finally had an active and mobile mountain division that could protect the country against any invasion. However, protection was far behind the U.S. at the time. With the Soviets on the offensive on the Eastern Front and victory in North Africa achieved, the next front would be a land invasion of Europe, which occurred in Italy. With Italy's official surrender in October of 1943, German troops quickly formed a series of defenses in the Italian Apennines, known as the Winter Line. Each ridge in the Apennines rose from 2,500 to 6,000 feet in elevation, filled with artillery, pillboxes, and elite German Jaeger mountain troops, looking down on all movement of U.S. forces. The objective of Allied forces was to push through the Winter Line and into the Po Valley, the breadbasket of Italy, and one of the last productive sources of food and munitions for the desperately starving German army. Previous advances by Allied forces were slow and grueling, giving the Germans time to defend against subsequent attacks. By the winter of 1944, 3 attempts to puncture the German defenses along the Winter Line had failed. Morale was depleting, as numerous divisions were forced to abandon the Italian campaign for the Normandy offensive. Soon, Italy became the Forgotten Front. With all offenses in Italy freezing in the winter of 1944 and 1945, the 10th Mountain Division was finally able to fight in a place of need. By mid-January of 1945, the 87th and the 85th Regiments landed at Naples, along with the 86th a few weeks later. Their objective was to attack and gain control of Mount Belvedere, a key part of German defenses in providing observation over Highway 64, one of two main routes entering the Po Valley. However, Mount Belvedere couldn't be scaled without first capturing a series of 10 mountains, nicknamed Riva Ridge, that Germans were using for artillery support to cover the south face of Mount Belvedere. The task for capturing Riva Ridge was given to the 86th Regiment. On the night of February 18th, under the cover of darkness, the troops scaled the ridges on 5 different routes. Surprise was key in the assault, forcing the men to endure the risky task of only attacking with bayonets and hand grenades until daybreak. The gamble paid off though, and the Germans were caught completely off guard. The 86th secured and defended against 6 German counterattacks and artillery barrages, some of which that lasted for hours. With Riva Ridge secured, the next phase of the assault could then begin with the assault upon Mount Belvedere. Remnants of the 86th, along with the 87th and 85th Regiments, battled their way up the ridge the following day, but this time, the Germans knew they were coming. Accurate and deadly artillery fire rained down on the regiments, but the 10th didn't retreat like their predecessors. They flanked around the rock-side faces to the mountain, and using their rock climbing training, strained the German defenses, forcing them back into the mountains. The 10th would go on to secure the ridge while strengthening supply lines, incorporating the cabled tramway they had used in Colorado to transport supplies and evacuate casualties. The 10th then proceeded north across Mount Gordalesco to Mount della Torcia, and by February 25th had maintained control over the entire mountain range, having finally accomplished what had previously been failed to do 3 times before. The importance and effectiveness of trained mountain troops was evident in combat to the entire 5th Army, while making the first step in invading the Po Valley. With Mount della Torcia secured, the 10th continued to spearhead the 5th Army's assault through the Apennines into the March offensive. By March 5th, the vital Mount della Spey was captured by the 85th Regiment, providing further security to Highway 64, the main supply line into the Po Valley. Similar to the Belvedere and Riva Ridge operations, the 10th quickly learned effective tactics after capturing a ridge, with securing supply lines and building foxholes and defenses. As German artillery fire bombarded them, the 10th was able to defend off German counterattacks for 2 weeks until their next and most deadliest offensive in the war would begin with the final push into the Po Valley. The final push began on April 14th at the recently captured Mount della Spey, where the spring offensive would fan off from. Pre-artillery and air bombings covered suspected German positions, alerting them of the imminent mountain assault. The 3 regiments quickly ran into massive minefields and heavily fortified German bunkers and artillery emplacements. Without the cover of night, German mortar and machine gun nests easily picked off men scattering for cover. It would take 3 hard-fought days until the division's objective was complete, along with capturing the nearby city of Toul. From there, the 10th's advance was all downhill, leading the U.S. 5th Army directly into the Po Valley, the long-sought objective of the Italian campaign. With Allied forces pushing into the Po Valley in late April, the Germans were in full retreat. As the British 8th Army and the U.S. 5th Army surrounded the resistant town of Bologna, the 10th Mountain Troops were used in spearheading the attack after the retreating German forces that were fleeing to the Po River. Using any form of transportation they could find, the 10th pushed 70 miles in just 2 days to the Po River. This left the Germans unable to mount counterattacks or defenses that they had previously been able to do in the Apennines. The remaining German troops left in Italy, most of which were fleeing into the Alps, formed pockets of resistance which were met by the 10th in the last week of the war and were driven off once and for all with the surrender of German troops in Italy on May 2, 1945. With the European War finally coming to an end 5 days later, many men of the 10th Mountain Division soon discovered the significance of their work. Due to the conflict of the U.S. not having a Mountain Division, and later the compromise of training and forming one, the U.S. was able to finally fill the void of not having a specialized mountain force. The formation of the 10th also proved to be a critical part in the straining of German supplies from the Po Valley, ultimately quickening the end of the war in the European theater.